Mary had always been someone who stayed in the background. At 24, she lived a quiet life filled with early mornings, long shifts, and small dreams. She worked as a janitor in one of the city's most prestigious office buildings, a towering structure of glass and steel that glittered under the sun and loomed like a monument to success. Every day, she passed sharply dressed professionals, heard the clack of expensive shoes on marble floors, and inhaled the scent of luxury perfumes that clung to the air like invisible proof of wealth. But she never felt bitter. She was working toward her own dream, one she carried quietly in her heart like a secret flame. Her dream wasn't anything grand in the eyes of the world, but to her, it meant everything. She wanted to open a small bookstore cafe, somewhere warm, quiet, and filled with the smell of coffee and old pages, a place where people could feel seen. Her late grandmother had owned a tiny second-hand bookshop when Mary was a child, and she'd spent countless hours there, curled up with fairy tales and a cup of hot cocoa. After her grandmother passed away, the shop had closed, but the memory stayed. It was that memory that kept Mary going through late shifts and aching feet. Every dollar she saved brought her one step closer. It was a cold Thursday morning when something happened that would change her life forever. The day started like any other. Mary had arrived before sunrise, tucked into her oversized hoodie, and sipping cheap gas station coffee. She clocked in, grabbed her cleaning cart, and began her routine. Emptying bins, wiping down glass walls, polishing elevator buttons. The building was mostly empty this early, save for a few early birds and security guards. She liked it that way. Silence gave her room to think. By mid-morning, she was working her way through the executive floors, places she usually moved through quickly and quietly. Floor 28 was always spotless. It held the offices of the building's top tenants, including the CEO of a massive tech company, though Mary had never seen him in person. He was the kind of man you read about in headlines. Young, brilliant, rich beyond comprehension. She imagined he lived a life full of private jets and designer suits, the kind of life people like her only glimpsed from afar. As she wiped down the glass walls of a vacant meeting room, a sound stopped her. Faint, muffled, and strange in the quiet. Crying. Mary froze, listening more closely. There it was again, soft sobs, high-pitched and unsteady, like a child's. She left her cart and followed the sound, weaving past empty chairs and echoing halls. Her eyes scanned the floor until they landed on a lounge area near the far corner of the floor. And there, nestled against a velvet couch, were two little girls. They looked no older than 5 or 6. Twins, judging by their identical light brown curls and pale pink dresses. Their cheeks were red from crying, and their small hands clutched each other tightly. Mary's heart dropped. She approached slowly, not wanting to startle them. "Hey there," she said softly, crouching to their level. "Are you okay?" The girls looked up, startled. One sniffled, her big hazel eyes shimmering with tears. The other remained silent, biting her lip and holding her sister's hand tighter. We can't find Daddy," the one on the left whispered. Mary's heart broke a little more. They looked terrified. "It's okay," she said gently. "I'm going to help you. I promise." The girls looked at her uncertainly, but didn't pull away when she reached out. She held out her hand to the more vocal twin, who hesitated before placing her tiny fingers in Mary's palm. It was ice cold. "Do you remember where you saw your dad last?" she asked as they slowly stood. The quieter twin spoke this time, her voice so soft Mary had to lean in. "He was in a meeting. We were waiting in his office. We thought he was coming back." Mary glanced around. If their father was in a meeting, maybe he didn't even realize they'd wandered off. But how had they ended up alone in the lounge? "All right," she said gently. "Let's go find someone who can help." She guided them carefully toward the elevator, her mind racing. There were rules about this kind of thing. She technically wasn't supposed to interfere with tenants or guests, but how could she leave them? She hit the button for the lobby, hoping the front desk staff would know what to do. The little girls clung to her side, trusting her completely. As the elevator descended, Mary glanced down at them and felt something twist in her chest. Their innocence, their fear, it reminded her of herself at that age. She remembered how it felt to be small and scared, and needing someone to tell her everything would be okay. Her own childhood had been scattered and uncertain, but she'd always remembered the rare adults who offered her kindness. She wanted to be that person now. The lobby was bustling with early arrivals and office workers. The receptionist, a sharp woman named Claire, looked up in surprise as Mary stepped off the elevator holding the hands of two small children. "Oh, Mary, what's going on?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "They're lost," Mary explained quickly, kneeling beside the girls. "They were on 28. I think their father works there." Claire's expression shifted to concern as she rounded the desk. She knelt, speaking to the girls in a soft voice. "Sweethearts, do you know your daddy's name?" The girls hesitated. Then one whispered, "James Callahan." Claire's eyes widened slightly. Mary's stomach flipped. That name. She recognized it. James Callahan, the CEO of Ultratech, one of the building's most powerful tenants, and one of the city's youngest billionaires. Claire was already on the phone, speaking urgently into the receiver. Mary sat beside the girls on a plush lobby bench, keeping her tone light and comforting as she asked them about their favorite cartoons and whether they liked animals. They'd warmed to her quickly, giggling when she made a silly face, one even crawling into her lap. It was strange, but Mary felt protective of them, like they were meant to cross paths. It wasn't long before the elevator dinged again, and a tall man in a tailored gray suit stepped out, his expression panicked. His tie was slightly loosened, and his eyes scanned the room desperately, until they landed on the twins. "Amelia, Sophie," he cried, rushing forward. The girls squealed and ran into his arms. Mary stood awkwardly, watching as the man dropped to his knees, hugging them tightly, his face buried in their curls. "I was so scared," he murmured. "I told you to wait in the office. We thought you weren't coming back." One of the girls sniffled. He held them tighter, murmuring reassurances. Then his eyes rose to meet Mary's. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he stood, holding one daughter in each arm, and approached her. "You found them?" he asked, his voice low and grateful. Mary nodded, suddenly feeling very self-conscious in her janitor's uniform. "They were crying on 28. I just wanted to help." He studied her for a moment, really looked at her, as though trying to read who she was beneath the uniform. Then he extended his hand. "I'm James. Thank you. I can't tell you how much this means to me." Mary shook his hand, feeling both overwhelmed and confused by the intensity of the moment. She didn't know this man, and yet something about the way he looked at her felt meaningful. "It's nothing," she said quickly. Anyone would have done the same. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. As James walked away with his daughters, Mary felt something stir in her, something that would linger long after the lobby quieted and the day returned to normal. She didn't know it yet, but this moment, this small act of kindness, was the beginning of everything. Mary didn't sleep much that night. She kept turning things over in her mind, the soft weight of the little girl curled in her lap, the feel of their tiny hands clutching hers, the look on James Callahan's face when he saw his daughters safe and sound. It wasn't just relief she saw in him. It was something deeper, something raw. She'd never seen a man in a $1,000 suit look so human, so unguarded. It stayed with her. By the time the sun rose, Mary was already dressed for her shift, sipping tea at the small kitchen table in her studio apartment. The heat barely worked, and the fridge made an odd humming noise, but it was hers. Her little world of chip tiles, second-hand furniture, and carefully pinned-up vision boards. She glanced at the board now. Photos of cozy cafes, smiling customers, worn-out novels arranged by color. Her dream. Her goal. And yet, for the first time in a long time, her heart wasn't on the board. It was back on the 28th floor, with two scared girls and their mysterious father. When she got to work, everything felt strangely normal. The halls buzzed with conversation, printers hummed behind closed office doors, and nobody seemed to know or care that yesterday something extraordinary had happened. Mary pushed her cleaning cart through the lobby, nodding politely at the security guard, then headed toward the service elevator. Part of her wanted to know more about the girls, about James, but she didn't expect anything to come of it. That is, until Claire, the receptionist, caught her just before she reached the elevators. "Hey, Mary," Claire called, jogging over in her block heels. "Wait up." Mary stopped, surprised. Claire rarely spoke to her unless it was something about a spill or a missed trash bin. "The CEO of Altera Tech, Mr. Callahan, he left a note for you, said it was important." Mary blinked. "For me?" Claire nodded and handed her a cream-colored envelope. It felt heavier than it looked, the paper thick and embossed with a gold Altera Tech logo. Her name, Mary, was written in elegant handwriting across the front. Back in the supply closet, Mary opened the envelope with careful fingers, half expecting it to be a formal thank you card, or maybe even some kind of reprimand for stepping out of her role. Instead, it was a handwritten note. "Mary, I can't express how grateful I am for what you did. Amelia and Sophie haven't stopped talking about you. I'd love to thank you properly, maybe over coffee or lunch, if you're open to it. I understand if you're not. But either way, please accept this as a small token of my appreciation. James." Attached was a gift card to an upscale cafe downtown, the kind of place Mary couldn't normally afford even on a special occasion. She stared at the note for a long moment, her heart thudding. Coffee with James Callahan. Was this real? The next few days passed in a blur. Mary didn't respond right away. Something about the whole situation felt unreal, like stepping into someone else's story. Why would a man like James take any real interest in a janitor? She assumed it was just a polite gesture, something done out of obligation. Maybe he sent similar thank you notes to drivers or doormen when they held the door too long. But then, on Friday afternoon, she found him waiting. She'd just finished wiping down a meeting room when she spotted him standing near the elevator bank, his hands in his pockets, his tie slightly loosened like before. He looked like he didn't belong, and yet he owned the space completely. "Mary," he said when he saw her. She froze, heart pounding. "I wasn't sure you'd be working today," he added, smiling in that soft, tired way that made him seem less like a billionaire and more like someone who hadn't slept in days. "I'm always working," she said before she could stop herself, and they both laughed. "I wanted to thank you in person," he said. "Again." "You already did," she replied, motioning to the note in her pocket. And the gift card was more than enough. He hesitated. "I wasn't just being polite. I meant what I said. Would you let me buy you a coffee?" Mary looked down at her scuffed shoes, uncertain. Everything about this was surreal. She was used to being invisible, and suddenly someone from a completely different world was seeing her. Really seeing her. "Why?" she asked softly. He paused for a moment, as if thinking carefully. "Because you were kind," he said finally. "Because you reminded me there's good in the world, even when I forget to look for it. And because my daughters trust you. And they don't trust easily." That answer caught her off guard. It was honest, unpolished. She found herself nodding. "Okay. Coffee." They met at a nearby cafe that weekend, neutral ground. Mary wore her nicest sweater, the one she saved for job interviews, and tied her hair back in a neat bun. James showed up in jeans and a blazer, no tie this time. He seemed more relaxed than before, but there was still an air about him. A quiet confidence, like he was used to people listening when he spoke. But with her, he didn't try to impress. He asked questions, listened, laughed at her stories about growing up with a single mother who worked 2 jobs and her dream of owning a cafe bookshop someday. He told her about Amelia and Sophie, how their mother had passed away 2 years ago and how hard it had been trying to raise them alone. He talked about his work, yes, but not in a bragging way. He spoke of burnout, pressure, and how success sometimes felt like a golden cage. They sat for over an hour, and when it was time to go, Mary felt lighter. Not because of anything romantic or dramatic, but because, for the first time, someone from that gleaming glass tower had treated her like an equal, like she belonged. After that day, things began to change in small ways. James would occasionally stop by when she was on shift, never for long, just enough to check in, to say hello, to ask how her day was going. Sometimes he brought her coffee, sometimes just a smile. It became a quiet routine, something unspoken. Mary didn't tell anyone. She liked keeping it to herself, like a secret kept warm in her chest. Then one day, a security guard handed her an envelope with a folded note inside. No fancy paper this time, just plain white with a line of typed text. Come up to 28th when you're done. I have something to show you. Her stomach did a small nervous flip. She finished her shift as fast as she could without being sloppy, then took the elevator up. The 28th floor was quiet, the sun pouring through the windows casting long golden shadows across the floor. James was waiting by the same lounge area where she'd first found his daughters. I remembered what you said, he said as she approached. She raised an eyebrow. About the bookstore cafe. That dream you've had since you were a kid. Mary's breath caught. I know this is forward, he continued, but I want to help. Not as some billionaire throwing money at a problem. I want to invest, help you build it. On your terms. Mary stared at him, speechless. He must have seen the panic in her eyes because he smiled gently and added, no pressure. Just think about it. Then he handed her a file folder. Inside were rough sketches, notes, even a potential location. Mary clutched the folder, heart racing. This couldn't be real. But it was. She looked up at him and saw not the CEO, not the man from headlines, but the father whose daughters trusted her. The man who listened. The man who saw her, really saw her. And somewhere deep inside her, a door creaked open. Not just to a new opportunity, but to a new version of herself, one who could finally believe that maybe, just maybe, her dreams were no longer so far away. Mary sat in the park across from the towering Altera Tech building, the file folder still in her lap, untouched. People passed by. Commuters hurrying home, children chasing pigeons, a man selling roasted peanuts on the corner, but Mary was frozen in place. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cold but from the weight of what had just happened. An offer, a real one, from him. She had reread the note inside the folder twice, the words feeling heavier each time. If you're ready to take a leap, I'll help you land on your feet. No strings, just belief. James Callahan didn't just want to help her dream come true. He believed in it, in her, and for someone who had spent most of her life invisible to people like him, that was almost too much to process. She spent the next few days walking a tightrope between excitement and fear. One moment, she was already imagining the layout of her future cafe, the smell of fresh pastries mingling with old books, the bell above the door jingling as customers walked in. And the next, her inner critic would whisper, "You're a janitor. You clean other people's dreams off the floor." But those whispers had less power now. Because someone like James, had looked her in the eye and told her she was capable of more. That changed things. She didn't tell anyone about the offer. Not her best friend Rena, not her mother, not even the kind old neighbor who always brought her homemade bread. It felt too precious to share, like a seed not yet ready to be planted. Instead, she quietly began her research. Late nights after work were now spent at the library and browsing business planning forums. She made lists, doodled floor plans, watched tutorials on barista training, and started mapping out expenses. James hadn't given her a blank check, he'd given her a chance. And if she was going to take it, she needed to be ready. A week later, she found herself once again on the 28th floor, this time with a proposal in hand. James welcomed her into his office, not the intimidating boardroom she expected, but a surprisingly warm space with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and artwork his daughters had clearly drawn, taped right beside expensive abstract pieces. "I don't want to be a charity case," she said the moment she sat down, her voice steady. "You're not," James replied, setting aside his phone and giving her his full attention. "I made a plan," she said, sliding the packet across the table. "Estimated costs, revenue forecast. I've been researching potential locations. If you're serious about investing, I want it to be a real partnership." James looked at the papers, then back at her. A slow smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You don't waste time." "I can't afford to," she said. "Not in life. Not anymore." He nodded, clearly impressed. "You remind me of someone I used to be." Mary tilted her head. What happened to him? James leaned back in his chair, gaze drifting to the window. He got lost in board meetings and stock reports. Forgot why he started any of it in the first place. There was a long pause. Then he added, "Helping you, it reminds me." From that day forward, everything changed. Mary's world expanded overnight. She wasn't just cleaning offices anymore. She was touring potential properties with commercial real estate agents, attending early morning finance meetings with James's advisors, and working alongside an interior designer who took her Pinterest board and began sketching it into reality. At first, she felt like an imposter in those rooms, but as the days went on, something inside her started to shift. She wasn't playing dress-up. She belonged. James never treated her like she was beneath anyone. He invited her into every conversation, asked for her opinion, and encouraged her to take the lead. When she hesitated, he reminded her of the twin girls who still asked when Miss Mary would come visit. Amelia and Sophie became a regular part of her life, too. James often invited her to dinner at their home, a quiet but elegant brownstone, tucked away from the chaos of the city. Mary would sit at the table, laughing at the girls' silly stories, helping them with crafts or homework, sometimes staying long after they'd gone to bed just to talk with James. And in those moments, she saw a different side of him. Not the businessman, but the widower, the father, the man who sometimes looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his back. One night, after the girls had fallen asleep on the couch mid-movie, Mary helped tuck them in. She lingered by the living room doorway, unsure if she should leave or stay. James came in holding 2 mugs of tea and handed her one. "You're good with them," he said quietly. Mary smiled. "They're easy to love." He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "You remind me of her sometimes, their mother." Mary's breath caught. She was kind, strong, the kind of person who never gave up on people, even me. There was something raw in his voice, vulnerable. "I don't want to take her place," Mary said softly. "I know," he replied, "and you don't have to. But you've brought something back into this house. Laughter, light, it matters more than you know." Mary felt something shift then, between them. Not romance, not yet, but a closeness, a thread pulling them together. Days turned into weeks. The cafe space was secured, a corner lot with big windows and a tree out front that would bloom in spring. Mary named it the Turning Page, a nod to both her love of books and this new chapter in her life. Construction began. Paint colors were chosen, bookshelves measured, flooring installed. Mary worked tirelessly, sometimes sleeping only a few hours a night, but she had never felt so alive. Then, just when everything seemed to be falling into place, a letter arrived. It wasn't from James. It wasn't from a bank. It was from Alteratech's board of directors. Mary stared at it for nearly an hour before she dared to open it. Inside was a single page. Due to recent internal concerns regarding potential conflicts of interest and unorthodox financial allocations, your informal partnership with Mr. Callanan is under review. Her heart sank. The words were cold, corporate, designed to intimidate. And worse, they implied she didn't belong after all. That she had somehow manipulated her way into James's world. That she wasn't a partner, but a problem. Mary sat down hard on the edge of her bed, the wind knocked out of her. She had come so far, but maybe not far enough. Not yet. Mary stared at the letter for so long that the words blurred on the page, the black ink bleeding into the cream background like a dark fog closing in. Her fingers curled around the edges, not crumpling it, but holding it like it might bite her. The cool March wind rattled her apartment window. And outside, the city lights blinked like tired eyes, unaware that her entire world had just tilted. She didn't cry. Not right away. Instead, she paced her small apartment, the letter still in her hand. The silence, a cruel companion. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. James, again. This was his third call in the last hour. She didn't answer. She couldn't. What would she say? Thank you for everything, but your world doesn't want me in it. I'm just a janitor with a dream that reached too far. No, she couldn't say that. But she also didn't know what else there was to say. By the next morning, her thoughts had unraveled into threads of worst-case scenarios. She made her way to work on autopilot, gripping her thermos with white knuckles, replaying the possibilities. If the board pushed back hard enough, they could suspend James. Remove him. All because of her, because he believed in her when no one else did. When she arrived at the office building, everything looked the same. The lobby buzzed with early risers. The security guard gave her the usual nod, but she felt different. Exposed. She avoided the 28th floor. For 3 days, and James respected that. He didn't call again. Didn't send any messages. The silence wasn't cold, though. It felt like patience, like he knew she needed space, and he was giving it to her. But on the 4th day, Mary found herself walking toward the elevator with trembling hands and a pounding heart. Not because she wanted to confront him, but because she had to. Because if she didn't, the fear would win. James was at his desk when she entered, looking like he hadn't slept. Papers were scattered in front of him, and his tie was loosened like he'd given up halfway through pretending to be composed. When he saw her, he stood immediately. Mary. She took a breath and held up the letter. Is it true? He nodded once. They're nervous. Old money and risk don't play well together. They think I'm a liability. No, he said firmly. They think I'd forgotten the rules. Mary didn't sit. Her voice was calm but clipped. Are they going to stop you? James looked at her for a long time. Then he sighed, walking over to the window. They might try. Then maybe we stop this now, she said, her throat tight, before it costs you everything. He turned around so fast she flinched. Stop it. Mary, you think I'm helping you out of pity or charity. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You've done more to earn this than half the people I've hired with Ivy League degrees. You've fought for every inch of progress, every decision, every plan. You built this dream with your own 2 hands. I just opened a door. I don't want that door to slam shut on you. Then we'll build another one, he said. She looked at him, searching for something. Doubt, hesitation, even resentment. But all she saw was fire. The same fire that had once built an empire out of nothing. And now, somehow, that same fire was burning for her. Mary sat down, finally, and this time the tears did come. Quiet ones, streaming down her cheeks. James handed her a handkerchief, and neither of them said anything for a long time. After that moment, everything moved fast. James called an emergency meeting with the board. Mary wasn't there, but she heard about it. About how he stood at the end of the long polished table, told them in no uncertain terms that they didn't get to control his integrity. That supporting small, meaningful ventures wasn't just a risk, it was an investment in people, in possibility, and that if they wanted a CEO who played it safe and never challenged the status quo, they could start looking for one. They backed down, reluctantly, temporarily. But the message was clear. Mary wasn't going anywhere. By late April, the turning page had its final inspection. The espresso machine was installed, the bookshelves stocked with donated novels and poetry collections from community members, and the mural Mary had painted with the girls was finally dry. A sweeping blend of sunrise colors across the back wall, a phoenix rising from the pages of an open book. The grand opening was set for May 1st. Flyers were printed, invitations sent. Social media buzz grew with the help of a small PR push James had organized. But Mary didn't want a spotlight. She wanted a soul. And that's what the cafe became, a refuge for dreamers, a second chance wrapped in coffee steam and soft jazz music. Opening day arrived with clear skies and a line down the block. Mary stood behind the counter in her apron, hands dusted with flour, heart pounding like a drum in her chest. Her staff, 2 baristas she had trained herself and 1 high school student eager to learn, looked to her with wide eyes. "You ready, boss?" one of them asked. Mary nodded. "Let's change the world, 1 cup at a time." Customers poured in, and with every smile, every compliment, every "this place feels special," Mary felt herself settle into a new identity, not just as a business owner, but as a builder of belonging. That afternoon, James came in with Amelia and Sophie. The girls ran up to the counter, giggling, holding hands. "We brought flowers," Sophie shouted, handing her a wild bouquet. "They picked them themselves," James said, placing a small wrapped package on the counter. "For good luck." Mary opened it gently. Inside was a delicate key on a chain. Not old, not ornate, but new, clean, polished. "Every dream needs a key," James said softly. Mary slipped it over her neck, the metal warm against her skin. Later, after the rush died down and the cafe glowed in the golden light of dusk, Mary sat at one of the window tables, sipping tea. James sat across from her, his jacket slung over the back of the chair, sleeves rolled. "You did it," he said simply. "We did it," she replied. He smiled, but his eyes didn't. "What?" she asked. "They're watching me, Mary. Every move. They're not done pushing back." "Let them," she said, "because I'm not done fighting." James reached across the table, not for her hand, but to place something beside her cup. Another envelope. But this one didn't contain mornings. It was the deed. To the turning page. Signed. Notarized. In her name. She looked up, startled. "I told them if they wanted me to step down, I'd do it. But I'd leave on my own terms. And those terms included making sure your future was yours, not tied to me." "James, You're free now, Mary. No more strings." She stared at the paper, then at him, her heart both soaring and breaking. Because sometimes the most beautiful kind of love isn't about possession. It's about letting go, so someone can rise. And rise she did. Summer unfolded slowly that year, like pages in a treasured book, warm, rich, and full of color. By mid-June, the turning page had already become a quiet staple in the neighborhood. Locals came not just for coffee or books, but for the feeling they got when they stepped inside. A kind of calm that wrapped around them like a favorite sweater. The flowers outside the window boxes bloomed under Mary's care, their sweet scent lingering in the air as people passed. Even those who didn't stop often found themselves glancing in the window, drawn by something they couldn't quite explain. But despite the cafe's growing success, Mary found herself in unfamiliar emotional territory, owning something outright. Something she had built with her bare hands and heart. Had been a dream. But now that it was real, now that the deed bore her name and no one else's, the victory felt heavier than expected. She no longer had James's voice behind her guiding decisions. He hadn't visited since the day he handed her the deed. Not because he didn't care. She knew that. But because stepping back had been his way of protecting her from the ongoing politics swirling around him. He had fulfilled his promise. He'd walked away so she wouldn't be seen as an extension of him, so she could stand alone. And she did. She was standing. But some nights, when the lights were low and the chairs were flipped on tables, she found herself standing in silence, aching for the sound of his voice, the look in his eyes that said, "I believe in you." One evening in late July, Mary closed up early after a quiet day. The sun was dipping behind the city skyline as she stepped out onto the small back patio, the one she planted herbs around with Sophie and Amelia during the first week of spring. The girls hadn't been by in a while either. James had become more reclusive, focusing on his new ventures, nonprofit work, advocacy for underrepresented entrepreneurs, but he never reached out directly. She sat down on the old wooden bench, the slats warm from the day's heat, and pulled out a notebook. Writing had become her therapy again, a return to something intimate. She filled pages with ideas, observations, small reflections on people she served, an older woman who came in every Wednesday just to read poetry, a teenager who whispered her dream of becoming a songwriter after school. Mary wrote it all down, documenting the beauty in everyday resilience. She was halfway through a paragraph about a man who left encouraging notes in random books when she heard footsteps on the gravel path. She turned, and there they were, Sophie and Amelia, holding a tray of lemonade between them. Their faces lit up when they saw her. "Mary," Sophie shouted, nearly dropping the tray. "We've missed you," Amelia added, placing it carefully on the table. Mary stood, eyes wide. "What are you two doing here?" Before they could answer, a familiar voice called from the garden gate. They insisted. James stood there, slightly out of place in jeans and a soft linen shirt, holding a brown paper bag. Mary stared at him. You came." "I never really left," he said. "I've been watching. Just from the wings." He stepped forward slowly. "The girls have been begging me for weeks to visit. I told them it had to be the right time. They told me you get to decide when that is." Mary's heart twisted. Amelia tugged on her sleeve. "We brought cookies. Homemade," Sophie added proudly. James smiled. "Mostly edible." They all laughed, and just like that, the distance melted. The girls sat on the patio rug, sipping lemonade and sharing stories about their summer camp, while James and Mary sat on the bench, side by side for the first time in months. For a while, they didn't talk about the past, or the pain, or the silence. They just existed in that moment, sunlight fading, laughter rising, lemonade sweating in the heat. But as the girls wandered off to chase fireflies along the fence, Mary finally turned to him. "Why did you really stop coming?" James looked down at his hands. "Because I didn't want them to say you couldn't do it without me. I never wanted to do it without you," she said softly. "I know, but you needed to know that you could." Mary swallowed hard. "And you? Are you okay?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm getting there. Lost a few things, gained some clarity, started working with a foundation that helps fund women-owned businesses in underrepresented communities. Your story kind of opened my eyes to how many people like you never get the chance." Her throat tightened. "You're helping people again." "I'm trying." He glanced over at her. "I thought I was done being useful. But it turns out, purpose doesn't retire." The girls came back, cheeks pink, hands full of fireflies in a glass jar. James helped them poke holes in the lid and whispered something to Amelia that made her giggle. Mary watched him, feeling the ache in her chest shift into something softer. That night, after they left, she stayed behind on the patio, holding the empty lemonade glasses in her lap and staring at the sky. She realized then that life wasn't about closing chapters with finality. Sometimes the most important people in your story step away. Not because the story's over, but because it needs room to grow. The cafe wasn't just a symbol of her resilience. It was a place where people's pieces came together. A reminder that healing wasn't a straight line, and neither was love. Love, real love, was patient. It didn't demand. It didn't define. It just showed up, exactly when you needed it most. Autumn crept into the city with a hush, laying golden leaves at the doorstep of the turning page. The summer crowds thinned into quiet regulars, and the air took on that unmistakable scent of wood smoke and possibility. Inside the cafe, Mary found herself slowing down. Less frantic, more present. The kind of stillness she used to crave now lived in her daily rhythm. And yet, something stirred just beneath it. A restlessness, not of regret, but of readiness. She had changed. Not overnight, not dramatically, but in those quiet moments between coffee orders and late-night journal entries, she had become someone she barely recognized and deeply admired. One crisp October morning, Mary arrived early, as usual. The cafe was still dark, but the sky outside was just beginning to blush pink. She turned on the lights and stepped behind the counter, smiling at the familiar sound of the espresso machine warming up. As she wiped down the surfaces and prepared for the day, a small envelope slipped under the front door caught her eye. No stamp, no name on the front. Just her. She opened it carefully, her fingers trembling even though she didn't know why. Inside was a single folded piece of parchment paper. It read, "Asterisk, you've created something timeless. Something real. The board couldn't understand it, but I did. Always did. I thought I was writing your ending. Turns out, I was witnessing your beginning. If you ever want to write the next chapter together, on your terms, I'm here. Not to lead, not to rescue, just to walk beside you. J**. Mary folded the letter with shaking hands, pressed it to her chest, and let herself cry. Not the kind of tears that come from grief or confusion, but the kind that come when everything finally makes sense. Later that day, she left a small sign taped to the inside of the cafe's front door. Asterisk, closed early today. Be back tomorrow. Brighter than ever, asterisk. And she walked. Not to escape, not to think, but to find him. She didn't have to go far. He was standing in the park across the street, leaning on a railing, watching the leaves fall over the water, as if he knew she'd come. Mary didn't say anything at first. She just stood beside him, the breeze lifting strands of her hair, the silence between them finally comfortable. After a while, he spoke. You did it. I'm still doing it, she replied. James smiled. Even better. They talked. For hours. About everything and nothing. About the foundation he'd started in her name. Without asking, because he believed the world needed more Marius. About the dreams she had for the cafe. A community garden. A storytelling night for kids. Maybe even a scholarship fund for young women who wanted to start small businesses. He didn't offer to help. Not this time. He just listened. And when she told him she didn't know where life would take her next, he didn't try to map it out. He just said, wherever it is, you won't be going alone. They walked until the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows across the street. For the first time in a long time, Mary didn't feel like she was reaching for something just out of grasp. She had arrived. The cafe thrived through the seasons. The community grew around it like vines, wrapping the small space in stories and laughter. People came to share, to cry, to hope again. Teachers, single parents, artists, lonely retirees, all of them found something sacred in the walls of the turning page. But Mary knew it wasn't the walls. It was the why. The place existed because someone had once believed she was more than her job title, because she had once chosen kindness over comfort, because two little girls with big eyes and bigger hearts had gotten lost, and she had chosen to see them. Years passed, but the moment never faded. Neither did James. He never reclaimed his old title, never went back to the skyscraper office, but he built something better. He and Mary began working side by side, not as partners in business, but as co-conspirators in purpose. They launched mentorship programs, opened satellite cafes in underserved neighborhoods, and told their story not as a tale of charity or romance, but as a movement, one that said, everyone matters. One that said, sometimes the people you overlook are the ones who change the world. Amelia and Sophie grew up calling Mary Auntie M, often working in the cafe after school, learning to bake, to serve, to dream. And one day, on a warm spring afternoon, Mary stood outside the turning page watching the next generation hang a new sign above the door. It read, "Where stories begin again." She smiled as James walked up beside her, coffee in hand. "You ever think about that day?" he asked. "All the time. What if you hadn't stopped to talk to them? What if you just kept mopping floors?" Mary glanced at him, a soft grin on her face. "Then I'd still be dreaming." He leaned a little closer. "And now?" "Now," she whispered, "I'm living it." And with that, they walked inside, not to finish anything, but to begin the next story, together.